Hi everyone. I suppose it began months before that initial glance across the conference room table when I began to feel that gooing emptiness in my marriage. It's not that Ryan and I had problems, at least not on the surface. Everything seemed to be going well between us. It was just a word I detested using to describe our relationship, but that's what it was. We had a house in San Francisco, good jobs, and friends in common. He was a software engineer who was constantly busy and exhausted. It wasn't anyone's fault, really? I tried to shake it off, telling myself that this was normal for a couple 6 years into marriage, that the spark naturally fades and turns into something comfortable, but comfort has a way of suffocating you if you're not careful at work. It was predictable and routine, but it was the little things that began to eat at me. For example, Ryan hardly looked up from his laptop when I got home from work, and our conversations had boiled down to talking about bills, grocery lists, or the next project he was working on. Then there was Eric, with whom I had worked for 2 years, the project manager for the majority of my campaigns. At first, it was strictly professional. He was good at his job, assertive, organized, and the type of guy who could pull the team together when deadlines were looming. At one of those fast-paced tech startups, everyone was always on edge, always pushing for the next big idea, the next big campaign. It kept me alive, kept me feeling relevant in a way that my home life didn't. It was the same kind of praise Ryan used to give me back when he noticed things about me. That Thursday morning meeting was no different. The room was buzzing with energy as the team discussed an upcoming product launch, and I was focused on presenting my strategy. He would say, "Your ideas are always the most creative." After one of my presentations, I would brush it off with a smile, telling myself it was just typical colleague flattery, but inside I felt that little spark. After the meeting, I went back to my desk and pretended that I wasn't impacted when my phone buzzed Eric. It was a simple message, and great presentation today really nailed it. I could have left it at that. I was laying out the details when I felt his eyes on me, not in an inappropriate way, but long enough that I noticed I caught his gaze and he smiled. There was something in the way his eyes softened that sent a small unexpected thrill down my spine. I returned the smile, but I couldn't. The first text was a polite thank you, but I responded with something more that I probably shouldn't have. "Thanks, I couldn't have done it without your input during prep." From there, the conversation progressed from work talk to late-night messages about everything, including movies, music, and random things that didn't seem like much at the time, but made me feel connected in a way I hadn't in a long time. Ryan hardly ever texted me anymore, unless it was to see if I had picked up something from the store, but Eric wanted to know how. We were co-workers and friends, so maybe I wasn't doing anything wrong, but every time my phone buzzed with his name, I felt a rush of excitement that I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just the attention though, it was the way he made me feel seen. One evening after a particularly long day, Ryan was glued to his computer working on some code that had taken up his entire week. Not only that, but it felt genuine, like he was interested in me beyond the projects we worked on together. I sat on the couch and watched him, wondering if he even noticed how much we'd grown apart. He rarely did anymore, so I grabbed my phone and saw that Eric had sent me another message. This time, it wasn't about work. It was just a simple question about how my evening was going. I looked at Ryan, who was tapping away at the keyboard, and replied, "Quiet you." From there, we spoke for hours that night, and he asked me about my dreams, things I hadn't given much thought to, what I was passionate about outside of work, and what I wanted for the future. Days turned into weeks, and our conversations increased in frequency. I knew I should have stopped it because something was changing between us, but I didn't want to stop because I needed it at work. We kept things professional, but there were these brief glances, and the way his hand would linger a second longer when we passed each other papers, that made it clear something more was brewing. One afternoon after a routine team meeting, I hesitated for a moment, feeling that invisible line in front of me that I wasn't sure I was ready to cross, but I said yes. We walked to a nearby cafe, and what began as small talk quickly turned into something deeper. We sat in a corner booth sipping lattes, talking about everything and nothing. Eric casually mentioned getting coffee just for a quick break. His tone was light, but his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity one couldn't ignore. "What's it like to be married to a software engineer?" he asked me once, with a playful smile on his face, and I laughed, but it felt hollow. Eric didn't push, but his eyes told me he understood more than I was saying. The conversation then changed, and we talked about our lives, our childhoods, and the things that excited us. By the time we left the cafe, I felt a connection with him that was deeper than anything. It was exciting but dangerous. At work, things went on as usual, but there was now an undercurrent of electric tension between Eric and me that hummed beneath the surface. It was evident in the way we'd exchange glances during meetings and how our texts had changed from casual to serious. I'd experienced this with no one else in a long time. That night, I lay next to Ryan, who was already asleep, and stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. I felt guilty, but not guilty enough to stop the truth. Eric made me feel alive, and I didn't know how to leave that. It was late when we finally left the office, and the sky was a deep shade of indigo dotted with city lights and the distant hum of traffic. The weight of the week clung to my shoulders, and I felt exhausted as I gathered my belongings. Eric was standing by my desk, his jacket slung over his arm, watching me with that familiar easy smile. "You're working too hard," he said. I told myself something more intimate, but it was harmless. I hadn't done anything wrong, not really, but deep down I knew something had changed, and that change frightened me. I paused, checking my phone to see that it was late and Ryan would be home, but I knew exactly how the evening would unfold if I went back now. I'd walk in, we'd exchange a few words, and then he'd disappear into his world of code while I pretended not to. His voice was light, but his eyes were intense, so I laughed softly and tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear. "It comes with the territory." He leaned in just a bit, his presence filling the space between us. Observe the silence between us. The idea felt oppressive. Having a drink with Eric seemed harmless, like a way to decompress from the week's stress, but there was something dangerous about the way he looked at me that made my heart race in a way I hadn't felt in years. I said that before I could change my mind. Just one drink. The bar was calm, dimly lit, and had a warm, cozy atmosphere that made it feel as though we had temporarily left reality behind. We found a booth in the back, tucked away from the... I tried to concentrate on the conversation, but my thoughts kept going to the way his eyes lingered on mine, and the way his hand rested just too close to mine on the table. The rest of the world, I told myself, was still innocent and safe even though I could feel the excitement buzzing beneath my skin. We ordered drinks, wine for me and whiskey for him, and the conversation went smoothly as it always did with Eric, but tonight there was something different in the air. An unspoken tension between us that neither of us addressed but that both of us felt. As I sipped my wine, Eric leaned forward and spoke in a soft, almost intimate voice. "How are things really going, Sarah? You seem a little off lately." The question hit deeper than it should have. I wasn't prepared to talk about it. Not with him. Not with anyone. But the alcohol, the dim. After a while, the alcohol began to dull my nerves, and I felt myself relax into the moment I laughed at one of his jokes. The sound felt foreign in my own ears. "Things at home aren't great." Eric didn't say anything, but the way he watched me gave me the impression that he understood more than I was saying, as if he could see through the walls I built to convince myself that everything was fine and we were just drifting. I continued the words spilling out before I could stop them. Ryan and I felt as though we were living. The lighting and the way he was looking at me made it feel safe, as if I could open up for a moment. I hadn't intended to be so honest, but once I started, I couldn't stop the weight of it all from getting to me. Eric leaned closer, his expression soft. "Understanding that you deserve more than that, Sarah." The words hung between us heavy with meaning. I looked at him, really, looked at him, and for the first time I realized just how close we were, my heart pounding in my chest. Separate lives, he's always working, and when he's not there, it feels like he's not even there. I could walk away, get up and leave this bar and pretend that nothing was happening, go home to Ryan and our quiet, disconnected life, or I could stay and give in to the pull I've been feeling for weeks, the thing I've been denying but couldn't ignore any longer. I didn't move, I didn't leave, but I leaned forward, and the moment my lips touched his, it was as if something inside me shattered every bit of guilt. His hand came up to cut my cheek, drawing me closer and intensifying the kiss. It wasn't gentle or soft, it was hungry, as if we had been waiting for this moment for weeks or months. His fingers were tangled in my hair, and I could feel the tension in his body as he held me against him. The fear vanished in an instant, replaced by a rush of adrenaline and desire that I hadn't felt in a long time. Deep down, I knew that this was wrong, that I was going over a line I couldn't. When we finally separated, the air between us crackled with the weight of what had just happened. Eric's hand lingered on my cheek, his thumb lightly brushing against my skin, and for a moment neither of us said anything. I should have felt guilty or ashamed, but all I felt was relief that I wasn't invisible anymore. I didn't care at the time. I needed this. I needed to feel wanted. I needed to feel alive again. Someone saw me, and I've wanted to do that for a long time. Eric said softly, rough around the edges, and I swallowed hard as I tried to gather myself. You don't have to explain anything, he interrupted, his hand slipping away from my face but still close enough for me to feel his warmth. I think we both know that whatever this is, it's more than just a kiss. And he was right. It was about everything that had been developing between us for weeks, if not longer. I was standing on the brink of something dangerous that could destroy everything I had built with Ryan, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to pull back. Eric's eyes met mine, searching for my next move. The decision was mine. I could still stop this before it went too far, or I could let go and let whatever it was consume me whole. I didn't answer him because I didn't know how to handle it. It was about the connection I'd been missing, the part of myself I buried in the routines of marriage, in the quiet of a life that felt like it was fading away. The only thing I knew was that I wasn't prepared to leave Eric's office because the guilt hit me right away, but it couldn't take away the excitement that was still on my lips. I drove home, my fingers gripping the steering wheel more tightly than was necessary, my mind racing between the heat of his kiss and the heavy, sinking feeling in my chest. The pull toward him was unmistakable now, like a magnet drawing me in, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to stop that at night while lying next to Ryan in bed. The guilt gnawed at me, so I turned to face him and watched his. I used to reach out and curl up against his sleeping face, but now it felt like there was a wall between us that I couldn't break. I told myself that I wasn't really having an affair, that it was just a kiss and a moment of weakness, but even as I was thinking that, I knew that what Eric and I shared was more than just flirtation. It was something deeper and more dangerous. The following few days flew by in a flurry of work and stolen moments with. We didn't kiss again, but the tension between us increased every time we were alone. His late-night texts became more personal, which I dreaded. I would pretend to be working late or have an early meeting, but in reality, I would be sitting in bed with my phone in hand, waiting for the adrenaline to start racing. Then, during a team meeting, Eric casually mentioned the upcoming tech conference in Seattle, which I would be attending. Next week, he said, I think you should come with me because it's a big deal for the company and Sarah. We need to showcase the marketing strategy, and no one can do that better than you. I kept my face neutral and nodded as though it were just another work trip, but my mind was racing with the possibility of spending time alone in a new city, away from the office whispers and my co-workers' prying eyes. Later that day, I found him. I think it could be a good opportunity for the company. His expression was soft as he waited by the coffee maker, but knowing what you think about the conference made my breath catch in my throat. The words felt weak, as if I was trying to convince myself that this was still about work, but the look in his eyes said it was all about the opportunity to escape our reality and enter something completely different. The excitement was palpable, but it also came with guilt because Ryan wouldn't suspect anything because he trusted me. I was always honest with him about my career and the demands of my job, but now I wasn't being honest with him anymore, and I wasn't sure if I even cared anymore. That evening, I told Ryan about the trip, framing it as purely professional and important for my career, but only for a few days. I said casually, avoiding eye contact, Eric needs me to be there for the marketing presentations Ryan didn't look up from. He was distant, checking out of whatever we had left on the day of the trip, and as we boarded the flight to Seattle, I felt that intoxicating mix of excitement and dread building in my chest. His words hurt more than they should have, perhaps because of how easily he accepted my explanation or because he seemed to have little interest in the details. His laptop was simply nodding, clearly thinking, elsewhere sounds like a good opportunity, you'll be great. When we reached the hotel, it was late, and the city lights flickered outside my room window. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the night settle over me. I should have felt crippling, overwhelming guilt, but instead I felt anticipation. Eric texted me room 1123, So I came by when you're ready. We didn't sit together on the plane, keeping everything professional in front of the rest of the team, but every time I caught his eye, I felt the weight of what was waiting for us on the other side of the flight. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and let the excitement take over. My fingers hovered over the screen as I texted back on my way. When I knocked on his door, my body trembled with a mixture of nerves and desire. The door opened, and there he was, standing there with that same knowing look, that same quiet confidence that always made me feel like I was on the right track. I could feel the moment slipping through my fingers, my heart pounding, the last bit of control I had left. The moment the door behind me clicked shut, Eric was on me, pulling me into him with a force that left me breathless. There was nothing gentle about it, no hesitation, no second thoughts, just pure raw need. We tumbled onto the bed, the weight of the affair finally coming to life in the dark room away from reality. Blaze inside the privacy of his hotel room. There was no pretense, no work-related conversation to mask what we both knew was about to happen. It was exciting and addictive, but every time he touched me, every time I lost myself in the moment, I could feel the guilt gnawing at the corners of my mind. When I returned to San Francisco, something had changed. Ryan didn't inquire about the trip, he didn't question the long hours I had spent in meetings, and he didn't notice how distant I'd become. For 2 days, we were just Sarah and Eric, not a marketing manager and her project lead, not a wife and a husband's betrayal. Though things weren't as quiet at work, the whispers became louder, co-workers' sidelong glances increased, and people began to notice how frequently Eric and I worked late and how we always seemed to be together. They didn't say anything directly, but the gossip was simmering beneath the surface. Then there was Ryan, and at first I thought I was getting away with it because he was too preoccupied with his work to notice what was happening right in front of him, but then he began asking. I tried to ignore it and brush it off, but it got harder to conceal the affair. It was no longer just between me and Eric. It was infiltrating every part of my life, contaminating everything I touched, and my marriage, which I had assumed would last forever, was beginning to crumble. At first, the questions were minor ones, like why I was working so late or why I stopped texting him during the day, and he would linger in the kitchen a little longer when I got home. I couldn't stop thinking about how easy it had been to slip into a different life and act like Eric and I were more than just co-workers sneaking around behind closed doors at work. We kept things professional, but everyone knew they didn't say anything outright. The affair that had started as stolen glances and subtle touches had now become a tangled mess of emotions, secrets, and guilt that I couldn't untangle. Everything felt different the moment we returned from Seattle. They followed us down the hall, and it was obvious that the walls were closing in. I could sense the cracks beginning to show in both my career and my marriage. Ryan wasn't stupid, but his questions became more frequent and pointed. For example, "You're working late again," or "You haven't been texting me like you used to," he would say with a hint of suspicion. He wasn't accusing me directly, but I could tell he was watching and knew something wasn't right. The worst part was that I didn't know how to fix it. Ryan and I had drifted so far apart that I'd found myself vulnerable to the first person who made me feel seen and wanted. But now, as I sat at the dinner table one evening staring at him across from me, the silence between us was deafening. We'd hardly spoken more than a few words to each other all week. He looked up at me, his expression tired, possibly even sad, and it suddenly became so clear that I had been chasing something with Eric that I hadn't had in my marriage for years with him. As I sat there, I realized that the emotional void I had experienced wasn't just Ryan's fault. It was also mine. I had allowed the walls to rise and the gap between us to widen without ever attempting to close it. I had wanted the thrill of meeting someone new and experiencing the unknown, but I didn't realize how deeply it would tear at everything I believed I wanted in life. I didn't love Eric. He had filled a void, but I couldn't imagine a life with him. But I had foolishly thrown myself into something in the hopes that it would fix the problem. The next day at work, things got worse. I was at my desk trying to concentrate on the deluge of emails in front of me when a colleague, a woman from HR named Jess, who I hardly knew, stopped by. She leaned in her voice carefully and low, as if she didn't want anyone else to hear, and asked if I could talk to you for a moment. My stomach dropped, and there was something in her tone that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I nodded. Following her to the break room, where we stood in a corner away from the prying eyes of the office, Jess began to look obviously uncomfortable. However, I've heard some things that people are saying not only here but also outside the office, and I froze. My heart was thumping in my chest, and I tried to maintain a neutral expression, but I could feel the panic rising. What do you mean, Jess? She hesitated, looking around as if to make sure no one else was listening. I heard from someone who knows you're. There's talk that my husband is becoming suspicious, and people know something's wrong with Sarah. I just thought you should know that her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Ryan wasn't just asking questions anymore. He was beginning to figure it out. My heart fell when the consequences of my actions hit me hard. I had been so engrossed in the affair and the excitement of being with Eric that I hadn't realized how close I was to losing everything. My marriage, my career, and my reputation. After Jess left, I sat in the break room, gawking at my phone. Later that evening, I found Eric in his office. His face lit up when he saw me, but I wasn't there for any more stolen moments. I was there to end it. My heart ached as I walked in and closed the door behind me. We need to talk, I said, my voice firmer than I felt inside, and Eric's expression changed to one of concern. I knew I couldn't keep doing this because the affair wasn't just a secret between Eric and me anymore. It was out in the open, and it was only a matter of time before it destroyed everything. I had to make a decision. I swallowed hard, trying to think of the right words, but he didn't say anything, just watched me, his brow furrowed in confusion, so I took a deep breath to try to calm myself. This is getting out of control, and people know Eric not only here, but outside of work. My husband is beginning to figure it out. Eric's face ped, his hands running through his hair as he let out a long breath. Sarah. I can't keep doing this, I continued, my voice breaking. I can't keep lying to him, I can't keep lying to myself. I knew that this was dangerous, and now it's too much. Eric approached and reached out to touch my arm, but I pulled away. Sarah. I said quickly, my voice faltering, I do care about you, but this isn't real what we have, and it's not a solution to what's wrong in my life. I can't ruin my marriage for something that will never last. Eric appeared to want to argue, but he knew that I was right, and that this wasn't sustainable. It wasn't easy to let go of the excitement and thrill of being wanted again, but I knew what was at stake. Eric finally nodded, his expression heavy with regret. You're right, we need to stop before we can't fix any of this. I could feel the tears pricking at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them back, refusing to cry here. Eric was catching up, and now it was threatening to destroy everything we had built in our lives. He reached out one last time, brushing my hand, and I said, I'm sorry too, as I whispered. I'm sorry for getting involved, sorry for the mess we'd made, sorry that I'd let myself fall so far down this path. And then it was over, with no dramatic farewell or lingering embrace, just the cold hard reality that we had both crossed a line we could never uncross. When I left his office, the weight of my decision weighed heavily on my shoulders, and I didn't feel relieved. Instead, I felt hollow. I had ended the affair to preserve what was left of my. The drive home was a blur, with my thoughts bouncing between the end of the affair and the mess I had to face with Ryan. I wasn't sure if I could fix my marriage, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep living the lie when I walked through the front door. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had broken between Ryan and me that I couldn't repair, that the excitement and intimacy I'd found with Eric fleeing as it was had filled a void that I wasn't sure could ever be filled again. When I walked into the kitchen that night, I could feel the tension radiating from Ryan before he even spoke. He was sitting at the table with his hands resting in front of him, the soft glow of the kitchen light casting a shadow over his face, his eyes far away, and a tension in the air thicker than I had ever experienced before. He knew I didn't need Jess's warning anymore, and I could see it in his eyes. The truth hung between us like a dark cloud. Sarah. He said softly, his voice strained, we need to talk. We need to talk. He began his voice calmly but strainedly, and even though I knew it was coming, hearing those words still felt like a punch to the gut. My throat tightened, and I wanted to run away from this conversation, but there was no getting out of the mess I had made. I know, I whispered, sitting down opposite him, my hands shaking in my lap. Shadows crossed his face as I entered his eyes, which were filled with a mixture of sadness and something else I hadn't seen in him in a long time. He said in a low voice, "I felt it for a while now, the distance you've been pulling away, and I didn't want to believe that something was wrong, but I'm not blind, Sarah." I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. I stared at the table for a long, painful silence, as if looking for the right words. I stared at him, trying to find the courage to face what I had done, my chest feeling tight, my heart pounding in my ears as the weight of my actions pressing down on me, and I didn't know where to begin. And I was only thinking about how much I had hurt him and how much I had taken for granted. He asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if he didn't want to hear the answer. The question hung in the air, heavy with the truth that I had been trying to hide for so long. I wanted to tell him that it wasn't what he thought, but the truth was sitting between us, thick and unavoidable, and I couldn't lie anymore. Not to him or to myself. "Yes," I whispered, breaking there. Ryan flinched, the pain flashing across his face so fast that, for a few months, his jaw tightened and he nodded slowly as if trying to process everything. He looked down at his hands and let out a long, shaky breath, leaning back in his chair as if he had been punched in the stomach. I swallowed hard, my hands shaking in my lap. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me, and the air between us was thick with all the words we hadn't said in years. "Why, Sarah, what did I do?" "It's not your fault," I said, my voice shaking. "I was lost. I felt like we were drifting apart, like we weren't connecting anymore, and instead of talking to you, I looked for something else that wasn't real." His question made me realize that this wasn't just about him. It wasn't that Ryan hadn't been enough or that he had failed in some way. It was about me having allowed my own insecurities and need for validation to lead me down a path that had destroyed the foundation of our marriage. Stared at me, his eyes searching mine for a sensible explanation, but I knew that no excuse could make up for the hurt I had caused him. "I'm so sorry, Ryan." I choked back tears as I whispered, "I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't mean to hurt you." Ryan laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "You didn't mean to. How could you not mean to? You cheated, Sarah, you lied. And now that we're here, the truth of what he said hit me hard, and I could feel the tears welling. Spill over hot and relentless. I had destroyed something precious that I had taken for granted, and now I was standing in the wreckage, not knowing how to put the pieces back together. For a long time, neither of us spoke, and the silence between us was thick with all the things we hadn't said for years. When Ryan did speak again, his voice was soft and broken, and the weight of his words crushed me. I knew this moment would come, but hearing it aloud felt like I was losing everything I had. "I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, but I want to try. I want to make this better." He didn't answer right away, but instead got up and walked slowly and deliberately to the window. I could see the tension in his shoulders as he tried to keep himself together. "I don't know if we can fix this," he finally said, his voice distant. "I don't know if we should." I nodded my heartbreakingly. "I understand, but I love you, Ryan. I know that doesn't make things better, but I still want to." In the weeks that followed, I quit my job at the startup because, although it was a part of it, it wasn't just about putting distance between me and Eric. I needed to take a step back and figure out who I was outside of the affair and the lies. He didn't turn around, didn't look at me, and said, "I need time." Those 3 words were a lifeline, even though they felt like a door closing. They weren't a no, but they weren't a yes either. Initially, Ryan and I started therapy separately, but eventually, together, we dredged up years of unresolved hurt and peeled back layers of pain that neither of us had acknowledged for far too long. The hardest part was having to face the damage I'd caused, not only from the affair but also from letting our relationship fall apart so quickly. Ryan didn't trust me, and I didn't blame him, but gradually, with the help of therapy, we started to rebuild. It wasn't simple or quick, but we were both dedicated. As the months went by, I thought a lot about what had happened. The affair, as intoxicating as it had been, left a hollow space behind it that hadn't filled the void I thought it would. If anything, I had to relearn how to communicate and be honest with him, especially when it was difficult. Starting a new job was another step in the right direction. It was a smaller company, less high pressure, and it allowed me to focus on myself in a way I hadn't before. Had widened it, leaving me with a bitter taste of regret. I chased excitement, validation, and something new, but in the end, it had cost me more than I could have ever imagined. Looking back, I see the warning signs. I ignored the growing distance between Ryan and me, the lack of communication, and the way I had started looking for validation from people other than him. I realized that the affair wasn't just a betrayal of him. It was a betrayal of myself because I had given up on the one thing that could have saved us, honesty, if I've learned anything. This emphasizes the value of being open and honest about your needs and fears before they become destructive. Affairs don't just happen. They develop out of the cracks we ignore and the conversations we avoid. While the initial excitement may be exhilarating, the long-term harm, the loss of trust, the hurt, and the shame, lasts much longer. I'm still working on it, and Ryan and I are still working on it, but for the first time in a long time, I feel like we're headed in the right direction. And I'll feel like I've done something right if my experience will serve as a warning and deter even one person from following the same course, because nothing is worth the suffering of losing the trust of someone you care about.